Hey everyone, thanks for joining us in worship today as we begin our worship series, Learning the Hard Way, Growing Through Adversity. And what we've discovered throughout the scriptures is that they are full of examples of people learning the hard way. Not learning because somebody taught them or because they read it in a book, but because they were trying to follow God and then fell flat on their faces. They learned the hard way, but there's important lessons for us to learn so that as we find ourselves in tough situations, as we fall flat on our face and possibly learn the hard way, we might get together with the biblical characters and those in our church community and figure out some of the life lessons that God is calling to learn during this difficult time. So thank you for joining us in this series, and I want to invite you, if you haven't had a chance yet, register your attendance in the link below. It's also your opportunity to submit prayer requests or any other questions you might have. If you are a guest, thank you for joining us in worship, and I invite you to sign in as well. And you're not going to get added to any email list, but it's simply an opportunity for me to reach out and thank you for worshiping with us. There's a link for the Bible app, the YouVersion Bible app, that has the sermon notes and more scriptures to read, so I invite you to check that out in the video description as well. And then finally, we're going to have, during this series, Learning 2.0. So on Monday night at 7:30, we're going to have Zoom meetings with some questions and dive a little deeper into our scripture passage and themes for the week. So certainly come and join us for that so we can see each other's faces and dig into the scriptures together. So that information is all in the links below. So thanks for your patience with those announcements. And now let's discover what the Israelites might have learned about patience as well. So the Israelites, and when we get to Exodus chapter 32, they've had this huge experience of the Exodus. They were enslaved in Egypt, right? Life was pretty horrific for them. And finally, Moses leads them out of Egypt. You've seen the movies and probably read this story before, right? The great Exodus, and they escape through the Red Sea. God parts the sea. The Israelites escape. The sea closes in on the Egyptians. Wow! It's powerful. It's this beautiful experience. And so the Israelites make it through that. And then we start seeing that they start grumbling. They start showing this huge lack of patience. See, the Israelites lose patience because they have unrealistic expectations and they have misconceptions about God. And so as we study the Israelites, what we first discover is they've just got some unrealistic expectations about their circumstances and about the timeline that they find themselves in. See, when they escaped, they expect their circumstances to just be about perfect, right? They expect to leave Egypt and then immediately arrive in the land flowing with milk and honey. But in fact, they're in the wilderness. They're traveling to their destination. And with their unrealistic expectations, they start complaining and they start grumbling. It's almost like they're like little children on a road trip. I'm hungry. I'm dying. Why would you lead us out here, Moses, just to let us die of starvation? And so God takes care of their hunger. And then they're like the little kids again. Oh, I'm dying of thirst. Why would we leave Egypt to just come out here and die of thirst? And God takes care of their thirst. And so they're grumbling, they're complaining, they've got some unrealistic expectations. They think the wilderness is just going to be about perfect, and they're discovering it's not. And so after they complain a while, some longer, then Moses then leaves for a bit, maybe to escape their complaining, but it's really to go spend some time with God on Mount Sinai. And so Moses goes and spends 40 days with God. But see, here once again, we see the Israelites have some unrealistic expectations of this timeline with Moses. They expect Moses to leave and then return immediately. And so in Exodus 32, listen to how they're losing patience. With verse 1, it says, "The people saw that Moses was taking a long time to come down from the mountain. They gathered around Aaron, Moses' brother, and said to him, 'Come on, make us gods who can lead us. As for this man Moses, who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't have a clue what's happened to him.'" Right? He's been gone 40 days and they just give up on Moses. I mean, 40 days is a long time. We're approaching that 40-day period as well, right? With our social distancing and isolation that we're experiencing. So we're coming up on that 40-day mark. We know it's tough. And so the Israelites are finding it extremely tough as well. But they've got some unrealistic expectations for how long Moses is going to be gone. And so they start complaining and they start grumbling and in the midst of these unrealistic expectations about their circumstances and about their timeline that they find themselves in, it gets worse because they have some misconceptions about God. See, the first misconception was that the Israelites expected that once God led them out of freedom, that God would make everything perfect in their life. Once they started following God, then everything would just be about perfect. Well, that really wasn't the case. They wanted God to fix everything ASAP. And this timeline was taking way too long. And so they have some misconceptions about who God is and how God works, and we see that in Exodus 32, verses 2 through 5. So listen to some of their misconceptions. So they've asked for Aaron to make this other god, right? And Aaron said to them, "All right, take out the gold rings from your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took out the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He collected them and tied them up in a cloth. Then he made a metal image of a bull calf, and the people declared, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf. Then Aaron announced, "Tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord." So there's all these misconceptions going on around who God is and how God is working. So for many of the Israelites, they thought that God had to be represented physically. For many of them, Moses was that physical representation of God's presence with them. When Moses was with them, then God was with them. But they had no concept that if Moses was gone, then God could still be with them. So they thought God had abandoned them, that God had left them, that God was no longer with them. And so they want to leave the Lord and go back to some other gods, some other foreign gods, and maybe those gods will give them better luck. So they've got a misconception that God will just leave them. For Aaron, he's got a different type of misconception. Because notice, as he builds this calf, what he says is, tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord, to Yahweh. So what Aaron's saying is, I've built this calf, and this represents God's presence with us. See, what Aaron thinks is that he can fashion a god in his own image. He tries to box God in and say, this God that I've created is the Lord. This God who is portable, this God who is convenient, this God who is visible, and tries to make that the Lord. I wonder if we've ever done that, to make a God in our own image and then say, this is the way God should be. I think this is the way God looks, or the way God thinks, the way God feels. And we create a God in our own image, and then we say, this is the Lord. Right? Aaron certainly had some misconceptions about God, thinking that he could create this God made out of Aaron's own imagination. And so all these misconceptions about God are floating around, these unrealistic expectations the Israelites have, and all of a sudden the passage continues, and what we discover is that it gets messy. It gets messy that the Israelites learn the hard way. So Moses discovers that there's this big festival going on. They've made this golden calf, and Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments, so angry, he loses his patience, throws the tablets on the ground, and ultimately it gets really messy. There's bloodshed, there's anger, there's yelling, and it's just, right? All this stems from unrealistic expectations of their circumstances, of their timeline, and then misconceptions about who God is and how God is working in their midst. Ultimately, the Israelites learn patience the hard way. but there's certainly some consequences for their actions and their lack of patience. So I wonder for us in this time if we are going to learn patience the hard way, or if we're going to learn patience possibly through the Israelites. Because the truth is that you and I need some patience in this time, right? Our lives have flipped upside down. Everything is changing. And even as I got everything set up for today's sermon, I got all the lights ready, the microphone ready, I get ready to hit record, and then my neighbor's lawn service starts going, right? And the sound of the lawnmower and the blower and the weed eater, and I've got to exercise some patience. I'm not used to exercising. We've all got those examples, right? And so I wonder for us if we will have more patience when we have realistic expectations of our circumstances and a deeper relationship with God. So let's explore what that might look like for us. First of all, having realistic expectations for our circumstances. Let's all acknowledge that we are in a time of wilderness. That we're not where we once were. We're not returning back to Egypt, right? And for some of us, it feels like we've even escaped some of the bondage and some of the things that were maybe unhealthy in our life before, some rhythms, some patterns, some routines. And so we've perhaps escaped that. But as we escape, or even be forced to move, right, we find ourselves in a transition period. We're not going to live in this state that we're living in forever. This is simply a wilderness period, and eventually we'll get to the other end of COVID-19. There's going to be something on the other side of where we're at now. But right now, let's acknowledge we are in the wilderness. Circumstances are not ideal. So let's lower our expectations as people in the wilderness and not at our final destination, right? And I think we give ourselves a little more patience when we lower our expectations about ourselves and our place that we find ourselves in. If you are finding yourself as a teacher right now, you don't have to be LISD Teacher of the Year. You just have to be a parent who's walking your children through their schoolwork. If you are sewing masks to help healthcare workers or to help your neighbors, then know that you don't have to be the master seamstress. You just have to contribute something, right? If we lower our expectations of what we think we're supposed to fix up around our house and recognize that maybe we're not all Chip and Joanna Gaines and we don't have to have the ultimate fixer-upper story from our COVID experience. I don't know what expectations you've maybe put on yourself. Or maybe even your place of work where you work and thinking that everybody's work has to just be top caliber. I wonder if we might step back and go, wow, we're in the wilderness. Circumstances aren't ideal. We're traveling to a journey. We're traveling on a journey and we're going to a destination, but we're not there yet. Right? Those Israelites who first escaped from Egypt, what eventually they had to learn was that they were on a journey, and ultimately their number one priority was just survival, right? It was, I've got to stay alive to get to this journey, to this place I'm going. So for us, let's have some realistic expectations of our time in the wilderness. And as we do that, I wonder if we might develop a deeper relationship with God in the midst of it. And as we develop that deeper relationship with God, what happens is some of our misconceptions about God are removed and they change, they go away. This happened with the Israelites. See, the Israelites were stuck in the wilderness, right, for 40 years. They had plenty of time to build a relationship with God and let some of those misconceptions go away. And ultimately what they do is during this time, during this journey, they developed that relationship and got to know who God truly was. We see in Deuteronomy chapter 31. So this is the very end of this whole journey in the wilderness. And Moses is speaking to Joshua, who's going to lead the Israelites into the promised land. And so Moses says this to Joshua, not from some holy wisdom that he has, but more because they've all learned this the hard way. He says, "It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. What he's saying is, after 40 years of learning the hard way, of 40 years of being in the wilderness, 40 years of being on this journey, know that God is with you. Every step of the way, God's not going to abandon you or forsake you. God's not going to just up and leave. So don't fear. Don't be dismayed. That time in the wilderness was that opportunity for the Israelites to really develop their relationship with God. And they fall over and over and over again. And every time they fall, what they discover is that although God gets frustrated with them, God is a patient God, slow to anger, as the scriptures say. And so we see over and over again the Israelites learn about God's patience, that God's not going to leave them, that God's not going to abandon them every time they mess up, but that God is with them on this journey. And so we have the opportunity to learn that as well. Because even in our Christian discipleship, what we discover is that Jesus over and over invites the disciples to follow him. And the disciples over and over again fall flat on their faces. And they go away from Christ, they deny Christ, they have one episode after another of just not getting it. And yet what they discover is that Christ continues to say, follow me. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get it right every time. But the invitation is to follow Christ. So I wonder if on this journey that we are on, if we, like the Israelites, if we, like the disciples, might continue to follow God and discover a deeper understanding of who God is while we are on this journey together. My hope and my prayer is that as we walk with God, we too discover God's patience and God's grace. And as we experience God's patience and grace in our own lives, we'll be able to share that with others as well. Amen.